Welcome to the Cabin Culture Podcast, where we spend a little more time diving deeper into all the fun parts of cabin culture. We like to think of this as both the material and imagined expressions of how cabin lovers, dwellers, builders, designers, and dreamers wish to live a more simple and authentic life. Today's episode is a great one for anyone considering building their own do-it-yourself A-frame or cabin. Rob from ADK Aframe joins Janice this week for a recap of all the ins and outs of his kit build. It was a massive undertaking as someone who had, up until that point, only really done some light home remodeling, but with a solid support team from the kit company and a friend named Paul at the local lumber company, anything is possible. Janice and Rob also touch on experiences starting as a new host and what Airbnb might be able to do better to support the host-guest experience.
Hey there. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. You?
Good. It's great to finally meet in real life, sort of.
Likewise.
Yeah, we have messaged for quite some time, but putting a face and a voice to a name is always a treat for me. I realize that the cabin world that you and I are part of is dominated a little bit by Instagram, a very visual platform. So let's pretend for a minute that someone listening to this does not follow you on Instagram, has no idea about your cabin or your story. Let's start there. Can you introduce yourself and your cabin, and then really paint a visual picture for us of your cabin?
Okay, I'll do my best. So I'm Rob Daniels, and with my wife, Melinda, we are the builders, owners, and hosts of ADK Aframe, which is a A-frame up in the Adirondacks of New York. It's got 3 bedrooms, a large sort of living area, 2 bathrooms, and is close to about 20-25 minutes outside of Lake Placid. So if you're a lover of the outdoors and outdoor activities, it is a dream location, any season of the year, really.
Okay, what would make it different? So you told us the bedrooms, but like visually, what would we see, and what makes it different? A-frames are all over the place. What would note yours versus others? What's unique about it?
So what we tried to do is, I think our tag in our Instagram says something like rustic modern. I mean, we're very much we like the mid-century modern look, but we also like the rustic. I've built some furniture with sort of reclaimed lumber and that sort of stuff at our home here. So we definitely wanted that rustic charm of, lumber and wood. But we also wanted a little bit of that mid-century modern with clean lines, and that sort of aesthetic from the mid-century modern period. So I think, it's a mid-century modern meets rustic cabin. The interior is we don't have any drywall in the house at all, which
I'm jealous.
Is a pro and a con. So it's all, it's actually tongue and groove, but we flipped the tongue and groove so there is no groove, so it's just flat. Obviously you can still see the line between them, but doesn't have that V groove look, and so it's either clad with that we used a stain, it's sort of a natural driftwood stain on the A portion of the house, and anything that is either a vertical or horizontal surface for the most part is painted a very, very, very light gray color.
Okay, I see what you're talking about. I'm looking at the pictures now to see the ones in the bedroom that were painted white, and they almost look like shiplap. But though you're saying those are tongue and groove. It's
tongue and groove. Yeah, technically it's not shiplap because it doesn't have that penny gap, although we use shiplap on the exterior of the cabin. But in the interior, we decided to go with the tongue and groove because it actually, with the tongue and groove, it's, held together a little bit better than with just a shiplap approach. But we didn't want that V groove, which to us was very much sort of a 70s, 80s vibe. So we went with the flat side to give it that more modern look to it.
Yeah. One thing that's notable to me that makes it unique is where the A meets the ground. It actually doesn't go straight to the ground. There's a little portion. And what that does to the downstairs bedrooms is actually gives you a bit of a headboard, which I feel like is one of the challenges in an A-frame. Was that intentional?
So that's part of the design of the kit that we used. And that's beneficial for a number of reasons. I mean, like you mentioned, it gives you somewhere to put that headboard and furniture against, so you don't end up with that awkward, dust bunny capturing space behind things, but then it also provides room to run all your mechanicals. So behind that wall is all the electrical and plumbing, in the areas where we need it, so that you have that space. And in some areas that you can probably see from the pictures as well, in the dining area, we've built built-ins into that space. And so we've added storage in the bed, in the bathrooms, and the downstairs sort of living area to provide a little additional storage. So yeah, that serves multiple functions.
Oh my gosh, that's so nice in a small space to make use of all of the options. I'm noticing you also have a basement though.
It's technically a crawl space because it's not a full 8-foot basement. When we designed the A-frame, it was actually just going to be on like a 4-foot crawl space, because we never have any intention of using the basement for anything other than storage and mechanicals.
Yeah.
But our HVAC contractor at the time recommended that we go more than 4 feet to just give a little bit more room for the mechanicals, for the furnace and everything. But we didn't want to go to 8 feet for the added cost of excavation, the concrete, this rebar spec in that foundation is a lot. So it would have been additional cost. And we knew we were never going to use it for anything other than storage and mechanicals. So we just bumped it up to 6 feet to let it, make it a little bit easier to move around down there for storage and mechanicals and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but having that extra storage and getting all the mechanicals out of the way so that you can maximize the space upstairs. Again, with cabins, it's always the challenge. You want to keep them small, but like there's a lot of functionality that still needs to go into a house, even if it's small.
Yeah, and the one thing that we didn't do, which was spec'd in the design, there is no access to that basement from the inside the cabin, which is sort of a downside, but at the same, in such a small space, putting a stairs down there also loses floor space. And so, we don't anticipate any guests having to go down there. And,
right.
So it just made sense from our point of view. But
yeah, and small spaces is all about compromise. And that feels like one worth making, just considering how often that would get used. Okay. The thing that makes your build super unique, I think, that we haven't talked to anyone on the podcast about is the fact that you used a kit build. And as you and I both probably know, build cost is like the number one question that you get asked on Instagram. And understandably, it's like the biggest thing that anybody dreaming about building a cabin is front of mind. Can I afford to do this? So can you tell us a little bit about where in the decision-making process you decided that a kit was the right answer? And then I want to get into some of the details of it.
Sure. I'm trying to remember. I think from the whole process started, like we've been visiting the Adirondacks for, a couple of summers, and we just love it up there. We're sort of 6.5 hours away from the Adirondacks, and we've always talked, for years about having like a mountain home, if you like. And we've been up there a couple of times, and we're like, we should really look for something, small that we could fix up, for a place up here. And we did that for a little while, and we came to the realization that we couldn't find, the location and condition that we felt that we could work on, and the price point. And so then we sort of quickly decided, let's build something ourselves. And so we started to look for land. And then when we, started to do that, I've done some minor sort of interior renovations and things. And so we're like, maybe this is something we can tackle ourselves. And it just made sense from that perspective to look at kits as an option to be able to build something that we could handle ourselves without having to use a general contractor. So that was sort of the decision. And then, Melinda, my wife, looked at multiple options, online, and we settled on Aframe as the kit. So it provided a lot of benefits. We could do it ourselves. You're on your own timeline per se. Obviously you have seasonal constraints and things, but you weren't, so we could kind of spread out costs over time and our labor and all those sorts of things. So it gives a little bit of flexibility in the build.
Yeah. How did you know an A-frame was the one? Was that just a matter of like which one had the right amount of space for you, or was it a emotional decision?
No, we've always loved A-frames. When we were initially looking, we were just looking at homes and, other things in the area. But when it came down to let's do something ourselves, it was kind of like, no, we want to do an A-frame.
It does seem, from everyone I've talked to who has A-frames, it does seem there's an emotional attachment. It is more than just functional, or like I'm trying to save money, which I think is where the A-frame was originally born, was like, if we can just have 2 walls, that's going to save money.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, it's a simple design. I mean, I think I posted on Instagram. I mean, the triangle is like the strongest geometric shape, so it kind of makes sense from a structural point of view to do a triangle. And I mean, it's definitely easier to build, but it certainly doesn't come without its like major challenges.
What were the biggest challenges?
So definitely the mechanicals. And the storage is one we've already touched on. I mean, storage is an issue. But yes, if you don't have a basement or something like that to put the mechanicals, it's you need to find space to do that. And it was in our climate where we need a good heating system and you're running ductwork and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
that becomes a real challenge if you don't have that space below to run all that stuff and to store those mechanicals.
So your heat is like a full ducted heating system.
Yes, and AC.
How did you make that decision? Because we grappled with that in our cabin of whether we were going to do like radiant heat or like or full ducted, but because of the space we decided against and the high ceilings, we went with mini splits. How did you decide?
Well, we initially thought we would do mini splits, but in talking to our engineer, in the climate, they were just in the type, so in New York, you have to do this thing called a res check, which basically you supply your plans to an engineer, certified engineer, and they spec out what you need for insulation, what you required for windows and all those sorts of things from a sort of energy efficiency point of view. And he was like, with a mini split, it's just questionable whether that could actually keep up with the heating demands in the coldest periods of winter. So it just made sense to go with a heat pump. So we have a heat pump for the AC and the heat for most of the time, and then we actually have a propane backup boiler furnace for the really super cold periods of the winter.
You have both?
Yeah, so it's just the propane is just a backup.
Okay.
So the heat pump does the majority of it. Yes.
Got it.
It lives on top of the heat pump. And so the heat pump does most of the work for the AC or the heating throughout most of the year. But then, when it's -20, -30 in February, the propane kicks in.
Okay. And is that wood? And you also have a wood stove, which I'm going to ask about next. Is that a yodel?
A yodel.
Your wood stove?
No, it's a Reyes.
Okay. Because yodel makes a round one that is beautiful and it looks like it. Your wood stove is so gorgeous.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we love the woods, and it's not a wood stove. It is gas. And that's one of the other challenges with the A-frame. So because of all the code requirements for a chimney to be 2 feet above the peak and where we wanted the wood stove, and this is when people contact me about the A-frame, there's sort of 3 or 4 things that I sort of tell them to think about in the design process. And wood stove location is one of them. If they want a true wood stove, you have to almost in the design phase, work with a provider of a wood stove, wherever you're going to get your wood stove from, work with them to figure out the placement, because there's so many things that impact draft, code, those things. And it was just physically impossible. We were too far along in our build process to make a wood stove work. So we went with gas because that does not have the same code requirements of the chimney being 2 feet above the peak. Because if we'd have exited right where the wood stove is, which is where we wanted the wood stove in that corner, the chimney would have been, 30 feet tall. Yeah. And with our snow loads, the company was just not willing to even support that chimney. Even though we have a metal roof and the snow pretty much slides off when it gets like 1 inch, 2 inches deep. Yeah. Like, it's just not worth the risk of, losing that chimney to a snow load. So
yeah, I think wood stoves, this is a great piece of advice, because I've installed now 4 wood stoves in primary homes, 5, and then 2 cabins. And every time it is a battle because of what they find when you're like, okay, this is where I want it to be inside the house. And they're like, okay, that's great. Now let's go up and see what we find above it. And then the distance from the peak impacts it because of how you want it to appear visually. There's just so many factors.
Yeah. I mean, in retrospect, I know you have a wood stove at the Cozy Rock. There is an element of me. We heat with wood here in the winter in Pennsylvania. We have, for many years when we lived in Connecticut. So we're very comfortable with operating a wood stove, but there is a certain amount of knowledge required, so you're not overfiring or not burning hot enough and those sorts of issues. So while the ambiance and romance of the real flame, is definitely a draw. I mean, I think renting it out does make me nervous to some degree.
Yep.
But I think if we were to do something, more, again, we would definitely start the design with, okay, where do we want the wood stove? And then design everything else around that wood stove.
Yeah, which we got lucky because Pete's design has the wood stove built into it because it's such a central part of it. So they literally did the first part of installation when they were doing the roof. We had the wood stove people come in and they boxed all that in so that it was ready to go for the second part once the floors were done. But it's not always that simple. And I will say this summer we had guests who the carbon monoxide alarm went off at 3 a.m, which thankfully it was working. And when we asked conveniently, this is totally random, but our yearly chimney cleaning was the next morning at 11 a.m. So they came and I said, this happened the night before. What happened? And apparently it's a matter of if the outside, it was like 80 degrees outside. So
so basically an inversion.
Yes. Yeah. And so it was pumping it back in. And so it was nothing we could have prevented. It was just a matter of if someone wants a fire when it's 80 degrees outside, this is what, you have to be real careful with it. And I had never done that. So I didn't know that. Now I know to warn people, but there's just a lot of room for error.
Yes, there's a lot of room for error and potentially, and it's the one thing that, it will keep you up at night. I mean, that's, you've got something with an open flame inside your house that if it's not being used properly, there's huge implications there. So
yeah. Plug for Nest, which obviously doesn't sponsor us, but would be great if they did. But we got that because it will alert your cell phone. So then
we've got exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Yep. And it does help with that peace of mind because it is a little bit stressful. And we now have them in all of our cabins just because I don't want to have to stress about that. But honestly, the only close to fire that I know of was caused by Sean, my husband, not Sean, of the chalet frame. So, I mean, even if you know what you're doing, you never know. Okay. I want to go back to the kit build. Do you mind sharing what kit you used?
No, not at all. So we used Aframe, which is A-frame, but with a V in the place of the F. They're actually based out of Estonia. They were started in Estonia in Europe, but they have, and I'm not quite sure how the business relationship, they're a sort of an office in Salt Lake City. So here in the US, it's aframeusa.com, I think is the website.
It is. I just went to it.
Yeah.
That is correct.
They, the plant that's in Estonia, actually, there's several people, there's dozens now on Instagram. When we started, there was really only one other A-frame builder who was documenting their build on Instagram that I can remember, and it was Rocky Mountain A-frame. And they've since, sold their cabin to somebody else. It still has the Instagram page, but it's not particularly active at this point. But so generally, if you are buying in the US, you would work with the folks in Salt Lake City. But I know there's people in Canada that actually the kits are actually shipped from Estonia, from Europe to Canada.
What comes in the kit? Can you talk us through, is this everything you need? What comes with it?
So that's a choice you can make. So I think, if I remember correctly, there's about 3 levels of kit. And we bought what's known as the structural kit, which is essentially the CNC'd trusses, and everything you need to basically build that triangular structure.
Okay.
So all the hardware, all the bolts, the floor joists that make up, the lower part of the A, the tie beams. So it's all LVL lumber. So it's extremely heavy, but it's all manufactured with CNC. So it's, basically like a big, mechanics kit of putting it together. So that's the structural kit. And then I think the next one is it comes with everything that you would need to dry in the home. So windows, roof, sheathing, that sort of stuff. And then I think the next step is basically everything for the interior. So you could get the shiplap, 2x4s for the interior walls and all that sort of material from them. We decided to go with just the structural kit from a financial perspective. And also in retrospect, what worked out really well for that, because our build took way longer than what we anticipated. I know, shock horror.
Yeah.
So we ended up with just the kit, which even just the kit, it's a lot of material that shows up.
I was trying to imagine what it looks like when it shows up. Is it just one big truck or
It came on one. So we were great. we were really lucky. There's a company near us that we supplied pretty much everything else that we needed, called Ward Lumber in Jay. And so we're down a gravel road. And so they were concerned that the triaxle wouldn't, 18-wheeler wouldn't get down and be able to turn around. So they actually dumped the kit at the lumber company, and then the lumber company put it onto 2 separate trucks and brought it out to us.
Really?
Yeah.
That is amazing.
Yes. No, Ward Lumber in Jay, New York, I cannot say more positive things about them as a company and the people that they have working for them. I mean, without them, we couldn't have done this build. It's as simple as that.
Question, because I know from you that they supplied everything else, like pretty much everything else that you were buying was coming from there. Did they know that at the time that they offered to do this, or was this just like, nope, we'll help you out?
They knew. So in the whole process of us going through this, looking for lots and what have you, we knew at the point when we were going to be building something, we're like, well, we need to go find out where are we going to get the stuff from. I mean, the nearest Lowe's was up in Plattsburgh, which is like 45 minutes away. And obviously, but Ward Lumber is right there in Jay. And we just happened to walk in one day and we ran into this one guy, Paul Mintz, and we got talking to him. And that was the light bulb that went off that made us realize we can do this, because there's this guy called Paul Mintz at Ward Lumber that is going to help us do this. And, without Paul, and his, team at Ward Lumber, we just couldn't have done this. And so, yes, they knew at that point that they were going to be supplying everything else. And so that's where we made the financial decision that because everything was being shipped from Salt Lake City, we had to, take into account not only the material cost, but what's it going to cost to ship that to the East Coast. And pretty much at the time, every truckload was like $6,000. And so if we could get that material locally, that's money that we could save. Yeah. And so we priced out the sheathing, the 2x4s, the 2x6s, everything that we needed. And we made the financial decision that it's better to go local on that side of things. We're saving on shipping costs as well as, the energy that's required to ship it across the country. And it also allowed us to, spread out the build. If everything had arrived in one, if you bought the whole kit, including all the I don't know where you would put it all.
Right. Where do you store it? And then it's all
sitting out in the weather. And, it took us 2 years to build the place in the end. And so if we'd have bought interior product, it would have been sitting, on the lot for a year.
Right.
So in retrospect, it actually worked out really well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder, if you were to do all 3 stages, can you order them at different times? Like order the first one and do the framing, and then when you're ready, order the next one?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because then you wouldn't have to worry about storage. It feels like that would be smart on their part to do that. If you're dreaming about a cabin build, or are in the midst of a build, or you just bought a place and are getting ready to host for the very first time. Regardless of where you are, sometimes you just need a little help along the way. Shared experiences from someone who's been there, advice from someone who's learned a lot of lessons the hard way. That's me. Or a cheerleader as you finish up. All of these reasons are exactly why I started offering cabin consultations to our Instagram followers and friends who could use some specific one-on-one help. I can't promise to solve all your problems, but I can promise to be transparent about our build costs and process, our organization and project management systems, our favorite and least favorite tools for renting, how we market, and how we found ourselves with almost 80,000 Instagram followers and 100% occupancy in our first year of hosting at Cozy Rock. So if that sounds like it might help you, feel free to visit us at staycozycabin.com or on Instagram at Cozy Rock Cabin and sign up for a time to chat there. Can we talk about Paul for a second? Because I feel like a common theme in talking with folks who've done their own build, whether they even built it or had a builder do it, but really is finding the right partners. And I got lucky that I happened to be related to mine, so I don't have good advice on this front. But how did you know when you were talking to Paul? Everyone talks a big game. I've learned in this industry, everyone talks a big game when you first meet. And the real struggle is the follow through. How did you know you could trust Paul and that he was going to be a good partner?
You just knew when you started talking to Paul.
Really?
He's genuine. He's a genuine guy. And you could just tell that, he's not just trying to sell us on a product. Obviously they're the only game in town. So they, locally really. So, it's just, you get that, whatever that feeling is that you're talking to someone, that they're genuine.
Yeah.
about
just the
it
gut
all.
feeling.
Yeah, just a gut feeling. And yeah, I mean, he's, I mean, still to this day, I mean, we're contacting Paul about, various bits and pieces. And I mean, he's helped us through the whole build. He lives in the same area that we built. And so he will even, sometimes if I need something and he knows I'm coming up for the weekend, he's like, anything, you need, I can throw on the back of my truck on my way home and drop it at the site. Yeah, no, I mean, it's like, I mean, although Paul, he stands out above everybody else. I mean, we had our nightmares from subcontractors, and Paul is the shining light.
That's so good to hear. So know that feeling I'm describing if you've had this with subcontractors where it's like you meet them, you love them, you're like, this is going to be great. And then they just, I have so many stories of these, and they either do some of the work or almost all the work and then end up disappearing or ghosting or screwing you over. And it's just like, it feels like in this field, there's no accountability. And like, how does Paul have the bandwidth to do this for everyone that he works with?
I honestly don't know.
But damn, I mean, I'm sure you've recommended him to lots of people.
Anybody that's talked to me about building in our area, I've said, you've got to go, and I've mentioned this anyway. I think anywhere where you're going to build, you should be going into your local building supply store and figuring out, is this a good fit for me? Yeah. And because, I mean, what was great about Ward, I mean, he knew we were just homeowners doing this. There was none of that, I'm not going to talk to you because you're not a contractor, or you're not going to be coming back for your third, fourth, fifth, sixth build.
Yeah.
It was super genuine, which I mean, I know locally here, I've gone into, lighting stores, like contractor lighting stores for parts. And as a homeowner, I at least feel as though I'm being treated differently.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I tell people, go and find, your local building supply company and tell them, what your plans are, and just feel them out. Like, do you think this is going to work?
Yeah. So when it came to the kit build, sorry, I just have lots of questions about this because I haven't ever talked to anyone who's done a kit build, but I had looked when I first started the process of trying to figure out our cabin, I looked at that site and thought about it. I knew I was never going to be able to build it. And I think at the end of the day, my cousin didn't want necessarily to build a kit build. I'm not even sure I asked him to. I just fell in love with the Raven house and that was the end of it. But was it mostly about making it easier for you to do it? Was it about saving money? Was it about just not reinventing the wheel? I really love their design, so it makes sense for us. What was your primary driver in going kit versus another route?
Definitely that we could do it ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean,
would you have had the confidence to do it yourself if you didn't have a kit?
Probably not at that scale. I mean, even we've talked about it, and if we were to do it again, we would not do something that big. It's pretty. I mean, when you're putting up those 30-foot long A's, and kudos to my wife. I mean, she drove the telehandler that we used to lift up the A's that we installed. The last few we did hire a crane to do just because it got beyond our comfort level.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's no way that I think we could have done this if we were having to, do this without the hardware that enables you to build it on the ground and lift it up into place.
Okay, this sounds very intimidating now that I'm like trying to picture what it actually looked like. Was it just the two of you on site when you were? Wow.
Yeah, just the two of us.
And how did you get the guts to? I'm just trying to imagine that first one that you're putting up. Did they give you YouTube videos? Were these no. IKEA directions? How did you even begin?
The plans and sort of manual they give you now is far better than when we put it up. It was basically, how Lego, you buy a Lego kit and each page kind of shows what the next stage should look like. And that's the next step you need to do to get to that. That's what it was like. I mean, it was a bunch of CAD drawings that basically showed the order in which the A's go up, and then you put on the dormer and you do this. And so it was very much like, it was just images. And so you just went from image to image and you looked for what the difference was between the image and now that's the next step. I mean, we did have phone calls with them, we'd talk about, best practices in terms of how to put the A's together and using, we'd use 5-gallon buckets to put the A's on the 5-gallon bucket so you can reach the bolts and everything. And so there was some guidance to that extent, but Beyond that, no, it was a couple of people had sort of done time lapses and posted onto Instagram, and we watched those to kind of figure it out. I mean, and I'm a huge fan of this old house. And like I said, I've done some interior renovation work and stuff. So I have a general sense of how a house goes together. But obviously we'd never done an A-frame before.
Which feels like a totally different beast, specifically because of what you're saying. It's going up so tall.
Yeah. And I'm not going to lie. I mean, we had hard hats and, it was pretty daunting stuff the first few A's. I mean, we had terrible weather that summer. I mean, it rained like every day. And so the site was all muddy. It comes with these, the holes for the bolts and everything. The wood had swollen, so the holes had shrunk. So we had to re-drill like every hole to fit the hardware. And so what would ordinarily take about 15 minutes to put up an A, it was taking us like an hour and a half, to put up these A's. And once we got a system in place, we were faster, but we just knew that pretty much every hole we had to re-drill. And this is where A-frame, I mean, the great thing I can say about A-frame is the service after the sale is like second to none. I would call Ryan, who's one of their architects / engineers, and I'd talk to him from the build site. We're having this problem, can you help us out?
Oh, thank God. You had someone.
I mean, yeah.
Okay. Which of you, who hit their breaking point first, and how early in the build was it where you were like, just that moment where you're like, I mean, I know when I'm putting together furniture, I hit that moment very early. Where was it for you all, and who hit it first?
So the way we did this is we took 3 weeks off work to basically get the structure up. So, for the first week, it was the four of us. So it was Melinda and myself and our 2 kids. And like they helped a little bit with putting the hardware on and that sort of stuff. But then the second 2 weeks, the 2 weeks at the end of that, we actually sent them to a local overnight camp. And so they were off, doing that kind of, camp thing up in the Adirondacks. So we spent 3 weeks and it was exhausting. I mean, we were any hour that it wasn't pouring with rain and there was light out, we were pretty much working on the A-frame.
Where were you sleeping?
We rented another Airbnb in the same neighborhood.
Okay, at least you weren't like in a tent. That would really put me over the edge.
No, but once we got past certain stages, we were in a tent inside an open A-frame.
Yeah, we did that. Not our tent, but as soon as we had a roof, we definitely brought an air mattress.
So, in that 3 weeks, I mean, there were times, I mean, you're with a person, you're doing physical work, long hours, you're tired, you're not eating a lot. I think it wasn't really a breaking point, but there were stages where we were getting near to the end of putting up the A's and it was the pressure of getting to a certain point before we had to go back to work. There was like, and I was kind of like trying to move, and Melinda was tired and I was like moving A's, like we got to keep moving. And that, there was some breaking points there, but the real breaking point was when we got to the end of the 3 weeks and we had the dormer added on and we had to put the roof trusses up on top of the bump out dormer.
Yeah.
And the both of us, we tried to put one up and we were just physically and mentally done. Yeah. And I think we had a day left or something. And we were just like, we're not going to get this done before we have to go. Let's quit here and we'll tackle this another weekend. We'll come up and get the roof trusses on. It was
Please
just
tell
that
me
point.
Did you go get a beer and like enjoyed the day off then?
It was so long ago. I can't actually honestly remember, but I'm sure there was beer back at the other, Airbnb that we were staying at. So.
Ugh, that just sounds so exhausting. I do know those points, except for us, we were like painting the inside of a cabin. This just feels like such a different degree of difficulty to put up the actual foundation of a place versus just the finishing touches that I don't think we would have made it.
Yeah, no, I mean, we look back on it now and it's kind of amazing that we managed to, over those course of the 3 weeks, there really was only a couple of days, that final time. And then there was one day where that was what it was, we'd rented the crane and that's not a cheap, I think it was $800 for like half a day. So it's like, wow. We wanted to have all those last full cathedral A's built, stacked in the right order. So when the crane arrived, we could start work immediately and we didn't have to have the crane for 1 minute longer than we needed it.
Yeah.
And it was just, and like I said, that summer, it was like, besides this summer that's just passed in the Adirondacks, it was like, it rained like every day and the site is muddy and, just that tension of like time being ready for something that's costing you a lot of money to rent, so.
Which again goes back to that build cost and how it's impossible to give someone an even close to accurate number. Cause like renting a crane, and are you able to get it done in that half a day? If not, there's another $800, just one
Right.
of many things.
No, I mean, I say to people, I mean, unless you build the same house at the same time and on the same lot, costs could be anything.
I know. It is a really hard question to answer and a really hard education piece to do time and time again. But I also was 100% that person, and you don't know what you don't know. So until you've done a build, it's almost impossible to understand why someone can't give you a cost, you know? So I can relate to both sides of that. Okay, I want to go back to you and Melinda, just because this is like so crazy to me. What are, as a team, what do each of you bring to that team? How do you split the work? Is there a clear division of labor? Or do you all just do all of it?
So I was definitely kind of the GC, if you like. I mean, I have a little bit of experience of reading plans and that sort of stuff. So, you know, from Aframe, I mean, they give you a plan set. And so I spent the winter combing through these plans of like, okay, you know, what do these drawings mean? What order do we need to do things? You know, figuring out what material we needed. So that was definitely my role, was sort of acting as GC. I worked with all the subcontractors to get those lined up, you know, not that there was an opportunity really for choosing at that time. If somebody returned your call, pretty much they got hired, which, you know, in retrospect was not a good practice, but
this goes back to Paul and why he's so amazing. We don't have enough of him.
Right. So that was very much my role. But, you know, I mean, Melinda's, like I said, she drove the telehandler. I wasn't willing to do that. I mean, she got certified to drive this thing by going online and taking these tests, and drove this telehandler over this muddy site and lifting, 300-pound, A's up into the air. And then, Melinda's definitely, although we worked, in tandem on this, but she definitely from the very beginning had a clear vision of what she wanted the inside of the cabin to look like. And so, and she's very good also at not only the design, but where things should be. I mean, she led the way on we have 2 love couches as opposed to having a full sofa, a 3-seating sofa and those sorts of things. So the layout and what have you is very much down to Melinda's, design ethic.
Because that is not easy. And I feel like different cabins have different challenges. For us, it was limited amount of space. So figuring out how you make it work with a wood stove in the middle and then not a whole lot of square footage. But in an A, it almost feels like it's the opposite problem. There's still limited space, but it's like one big open room usually, that figuring out how you organize furniture to create sections within that room or tell people or guide people how they should use the space is really tricky.
Yeah, no, I mean, we changed things on the fly. I mean, our island was supposed to be, I think, another foot longer. But when we start, when you get there and you start putting tape on the floor as to where everything's spec'd in the plans, and because you can look at one thing on a plan, but then when you start walking in the space, we were like, that's a little long. Is that if someone pulls their chair out from the dining room table, are they going to bump into the island?
Yeah.
So we shrank the size of the island. So that kind of stuff a lot of it was happening on the fly. We were going to have a rectangular dining table. We spec'd it out on the floor, and then we were like, maybe an oval is a better shape. You can still get the same number of people, but it just has that little bit of a smaller footprint.
Yeah.
And we always wanted, even though it's open, we wanted that sort of sense that this is where you relax. This is the seating area with the fire, and here's the dining area. Here's the kitchen area. We did want that divide, visually.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking at your pictures as we're talking about this. In the YouTube version, I'll drop them in so that other folks can see as you're talking about it. But you've done a good job of that, of dividing up the space. And that is one of the advantages of being there for the whole build, is that before you're approaching the next step, it's like, okay, let's map this out. And I really struggled with that because I'm such a visual person being far away. I will say, shout out to Magic Plan. I tried a bunch of different apps for arranging furniture and figuring out what size couch we could order from a distance because I couldn't tape out the floors. Right. And Magic Plan was life-saving because it looks like that kind of top-down diagram, but then you can turn it to 3D mode and actually kind of walk through the cabin to get a feel for space.
And does that even have will they give you an average human to put in that space?
No, maybe they do now because they're constantly making improvements. But no, Pete, I used for that a lot, and Corey, because Corey had done building, but Pete knew. He would look at my plans and be like, okay, but you want to think about this space behind a dishwasher or whatever he said. I don't even remember. And I was like, oh, never would have thought of that. So it is helpful to have someone who's done it before to help with that kind of thing. But if you're not on site, Magic Plan was game changing. That was really helpful.
I mean, for everything. I mean, the bedrooms, the bathrooms. I mean, there was tape on the floor. Working with the electrician about we have lights on the side of the bed, and so it was like paramount that those. And plus because we've got wood everywhere, it's not like drywall where you can move something and fix the drywall. I mean, moving something now on our walls is somewhat like daunting. So when you make that cut into that, you want to be 100% sure that you're making that all in the right spot.
That's such a good point, because drywall really is easy to fix, and wood everywhere is not. It's a whole different challenge. Okay, you mentioned the wood tones, and to me, this is the hardest thing about A-frames because, to be clear, I have no experience building one, but I would think it's the hardest because I really like wood interior on cabins. To me, that is the cabin feel. And yet in an A-frame, when every single space is covered with wood, but you don't necessarily want them all the same tone, but matching wood tones, how did you guys even begin to figure out which wood was going to be which color?
So luckily, we went through the whole design process and the buying of the lot, over the winter period. And so we had like 6 months basically between, committing to A-frame with the build, with the purchase of the kit until we actually started the build. And so that period is when we spent basically, going through the interior and figuring out material choices. And so, we went to Ward Lumber and we picked up the pine that we were going to use. And we just went to, Lowe's, bought a bunch of stains, and we knew we wanted to kind of have, a mix of wood and paint because, besides the window wall, we do have skylights. That's another concern with the A-frame is that unless you have skylights, do you end up with dark rooms? And so the wood choice, the stain choice was very important to us to not create dark spaces. But we didn't just want to put, we didn't want that yellow look of like white pine. And, so we knew we wanted to stain. And so, we just picked out a bunch of those new, Minwax semi-transparent stains and tried a bunch of them against what we thought was the paint color we were going to use. We were going to use white, but then we decided that was actually too stark against when we put a white wall up actually in the space, which is when you really see what your choices look like. We're like, that's way too stark. So we kind of, put some gray into it to give it a little bit more of a warmer look. So it's just trial and error.
Man, when you said that, of all the samples, I literally had a physical reaction in my chest because it just takes me right back to the amount of decisions you have to make in the course of a build and how exhausting that can feel when there's so much pressure. You've saved up so much money and you're spending so much money and you don't want to get it wrong. But then the amount of time to get you to a right choice is just overwhelming.
Yeah, no, and again, kudos to Melinda. The tile that's in the kitchen and the bathrooms, we knew because of a small space, we wanted to use the same tile in all of those 3 spaces. We didn't want, to make it feel like you were going into a new space. We wanted to be cohesive. And I remember I was up in the Adirondacks working on the A-frame, and she was at a tile store down here in Delaware. And, she had the samples with her. And of course, on the phone, we're trying to FaceTime and it's hard to see. But, the tile, she, knocked it out of the park with that, color of the tile with the cabinet colors that we were using against the wood and everything. And so, but it's huge time commitment.
Yeah.
Going to stores, looking at time, and then, just hoping that you made the right decision. Because especially with something like tile, it's not always returnable. Because if it's a special order kind of situation, you're stuck with it. So
right. And that's where designers, I think, have an advantage. Some folks building this do this in their real life job, and then they've seen a ton of different things. And so they can go in with some, but if you aren't a designer, myself for sure, then the choices just feel so overwhelming because there's practical sides to the choices, like with tile, like which one's clean easier, which one, whatever it is, on top of color and how it looks. And there's so much pressure on the aesthetic and not just the function. It just feels, oh man, this is like, I know it's not PTSD, but like there is some something in my body is like, okay, this is this is remembering how hard
Right.
that part of
And
the
it's
process
not
was.
only the number of things, it's that there's other things, you know, everything's happening at once. Like you're doing with tile here and you're dealing with something
Yes.
else in another part of the house. That's,
Yes.
you know, the electrician needs this to be done in order to do this next step. So it's not just a linear
Yes.
track that you're on.
Oh, and you
from start
feel
to
that
finish.
more than most, because I think most of us who haven't built themselves have the advantage of having a GC who has done this time and time again. And my cousin could give me a general idea of like, here's what I need from you now, versus you had to manage all of those timelines yourself amidst a pandemic when everything was delayed. What was the biggest challenge you ran into on that front?
Luckily, again, with Paul, I mean, he knew
Paul.
the issues coming down the pike. And so we did order materials way ahead of time. And they were happy to store it for us because he knew metal roofing, you know, he gets warned, you know, metal roofing is going up 5%, 10%. Window costs are going up. And so we ordered our windows and our roof material probably 8 months before we really needed it.
That's
and then
amazing.
They stored it at their site until we needed it.
I just can't imagine, Rob, that he does this for everyone. You all must be like best friends by now. There's no way.
I mean, we
can
are
do this
friends
for
with Paul,
everyone.
and he's, you know, I mean, just recently, I mean, we needed screens replaced on a couple of the windows, and he went over and replaced the screens for us.
I want to meet Paul.
He's a character.
I want Paul to move to Maine.
No, you can't. No, you can't tempt Paul away from the Adirondacks.
I wouldn't do that to you, Rob. But man, I mean, it is nice to have a Paul. But I do think it's important to note that you find Pauls at the local hardware stores. You don't necessarily find Pauls at the Lowe's and the Home Depot.
Not necessarily. I mean, I'm not, you know, yeah, I can't say for sure, but yeah, I think they're a employee-owned business, and so They have a vested interest in customer service, and you know, so yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the kit sounds, I mean, it sounds intimidating for me personally to build, but a whole lot easier than comparing it to the alternative, which is to build it yourself without a kit. It sounds pretty good. What were some of the biggest challenges aside from like the actual building? Were there any other challenges that came with doing a kit versus another way?
Not having done it the other way, I don't know, but you know, I think the biggest challenge was really not necessarily associated with the kit. I mean, for us, it was weather and the fact that we are doing it ourselves. I mean, obviously, we did hire subcontractors, so you know, I got the sheeting on the roof maybe a third of the way up, but that's when it got to me. That was the uncomfortable. So we hired somebody to complete the sheeting on the roof.
Yeah.
So doing it yourself, the timelines, because it does stretch out, you're dealing with, you know, weather conditions that are not ideal. And so you don't have that quick wrapping up of the house, like we're dried in, you know, so, and it was just a really bad weather period for us. And so that was definitely a challenge, you know, and we're 6.5 hours away. And so that was a challenge, but I don't know if there was anything, you know, I don't think it was necessarily a challenge, but doing the kit just made it all that more possible for us.
Yeah. Okay. So we only have about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to get to some of the hosting and marketing because it feels like, I mean, I've been talking to you for years throughout the build, and it feels like the minute you finished, you were just like up and running. What did you do during the build that set you up for success to be operating so quickly after completion?
Watching your reels and stories. I mean, I think, you know, and I went back through our DMs to kind of figure out, you know, what was it that triggered, you know, corresponding with you. And I think it was, you had posted, I think, about, you know, photographers and stuff. And I had reached out about, you know, how did you connect with these photographers? How did you work with them? And then, you know, very early on, I think you were one of the first, certainly for the, you know, pages that I'm following on Instagram, it was actually putting out there on stories like the, you know, the real deal with, you know, being an Airbnb and a host and all that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, I was following all that while we were doing the build. And so we were kind of preparing ourselves for, you know, being ready for that. But then, I mean, in terms of, we were rushing to get finished because we wanted to be able to take advantage of, I mean, you know, there was a huge expense for this for us. And so we did want to take advantage of this past summer to try to, you know, recoup some of those costs from this is a long-term, you know, financial plan for us. From from both, a retirement perspective, as well as like helping, pay to get the kids through college. But initially it was sort of like, we need to, at the end there, you're just like, budget kind of goes out the window. It's just like, what do I need to do to get it done? And
I remember that feeling so well, of just being like, you've been bleeding money for months and months and months. And you're like, I know there's an end in sight where it will go the other way around, but I need that to get here.
Yeah. And so that was really the trigger for us, was like, can we get done in time to take advantage? And luckily, we didn't seem to have a problem getting people in over the summer. I mean, even though it was pretty short between us being done and then being able to say, okay, we're ready for, hosting. So yeah, very much this summer has been, we've spent plenty of time up there, obviously, during the build. And so we were comfortable this summer to be like, okay, we don't, we're happy to let other people enjoy this. And that was part of this, was not only just us being able to enjoy it, but to allow other people to enjoy it. I mean, we love it up there. And so it is, we get off the highway and like your blood pressure just, falls, and it's just a super relaxing place to be. And so it was just, I mean, it was, a lot of it was just a leap of faith. We're like, we think we have this correct in terms of systems and protocols and the listing on Airbnb, but then things happen that you kind of like bang your head against a brick wall. And you're like, people haven't read your sort of rules on Instagram, on Airbnb, or, you still get requests for certain things that you say, you don't allow. And, it's just, but that's all part of the learning process.
I was just going to say, what are the biggest things you've learned in your first couple months of hosting?
I think, and I don't want to, hit on anybody who's using Airbnb, but I mean, I think people are not reading full description. I mean, I don't know whether people are just reacting to imagery and booking on imagery.
Yes.
So they're not, because we do have a banister that could act for small children like a ladder. And so we make that very clear in the listing, or we try to, and it's not really I should back up here. I don't blame the folks using Airbnb. I actually think Airbnb could be doing a much better job on a lot of these things. Like we have, you in Airbnb check certain things that you allow and you don't allow. To me, if someone books and so we say we don't allow children under the age of 8 because of this safety reason. But if people get in touch with us and explain, we're, in some cases we have allowed that because they've convinced us that that's not going to be an issue.
Yeah.
But, for instance, we're, a no pet home, and we have a cat and I'm a big dog lover and everything, but we've just made that decision for us for several reasons. So if that's checked off, and then that should, I guess, once you try to book it, there should be sort of a check, Airbnb should be like, just as a reminder, this cabin doesn't allow, and then, so that's been our biggest challenge, is that Airbnb, and I think it's because Airbnb wants, obviously, anybody to be able to book anything. And so we've probably, out of the bookings we've had, there's been at least another third to a half where we've had to correspond with them and, deal with Airbnb to sort of say, that you're not a good fit for our
That's
cabin.
a high number.
And I don't know whether it's just because we're new that's the case.
Right.
So that's been the most challenging, I guess. I'm sure like everybody, we were super nervous, but I got to say, it's now, we actually are really enjoying it. Because like you say, you get that feedback from guests, and it's just like, that feeling is awesome. And so we don't really, think about it now as being a concern. So
you've done a really good job marketing it too throughout the build. So by the time you launched, I feel like, had put a lot of work into documenting it and then getting it photographed really quickly. What worked really well for you on that front?
So there's a small community of us in the neighborhood where we are at our Airbnbs, and I actually started a sort of an Instagram, group amongst us to kind of just, help each other out and like, hey, do you have a good plumber, cleaner, whatever, that sort of thing. I do very much see it as a community. So there's a few people, that I followed on Instagram, that, I've just corresponded with, and they've been gracious enough to say, you know, who they really enjoyed working with as photographers and those sorts of things. And so that's where that sort of came from. And we knew we wanted, as soon as we were done, we had a very short window. I don't have a particularly new iPhone, so it doesn't take particularly good pictures. Most of the ones that were captured right as we finished, but before we got a professional in there with Melinda with her, you know, better iPhone, which, you know, you got to give it to the iPhone. They can take some pretty good pictures. So
pretty much all I use anymore.
It was just getting those recommendations from other people in the local community, like who have you worked for, you know, who have worked for you and who have you enjoyed using and that kind of stuff. And it was just then reaching out to those people. So Alex and Aaron were two, you know, photographers that other people had worked with that we reached out to. And, you know, so.
Who did your listing photos? Or is it a mix?
It's a mix. A lot of it is our pictures that we've taken, but then it does now also include stuff from Alex and Aaron as well.
I was going to say, there's a couple in here that are really beautifully creative, which are a nice, when you're scrolling through your Airbnb listing, it's nice to be like, straightforward. I know exactly what I'm getting. Oh, and then this is a beautiful angle. You know, it just adds that kind of like feeling on top of the, I'm getting all my questions answered.
Right. Yeah. It was very much wanting to like not only show what's in the house, but, you know, give a little bit of a mood feeling as well. So yeah, there's some of those sort of like, you know, I don't want to say lifestyle, but sort of vignette pictures.
Yeah. It does a really good job of that. Yeah. Okay. I have a couple questions to ask at the end that we ask everyone. I think you probably know what one of them is. But first, I want to hear about your cabin fashion. Do you and Melinda have any particular favorites in terms of your cabin fashion?
Not really at this point, because it's mostly been dirty jeans and T-shirts.
Because you've been working.
But there is a pair of L.O. Bean slippers that stay up there for me. So they're not your style, but they're, you know, I have a pair here, I have a pair up there, and they, you know, they stay up there. So definitely slippers. But I mean, yeah, I mean, up to this point, it's, you know, and as you know, I mean, even when we go up now, I mean, a lot of it is doing little maintenance things. You know, we're still kind of, you know, I've been working on getting you know, we have a native sort of wildflower, you know, meadow around there. So I've been working on making sure that's getting established. And so it is, you know, very much like jeans, T-shirt, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Melinda's definitely, she runs cold, I run hot. So she is definitely like, you know, the blanket, you know, hoodie, you know, that sort of stuff, blankets.
Sitting right in front of the fire.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can see it. I love it.
When I'll be in like shorts and T-shirt and she's under two blankets and a hoodie.
Yeah. I don't even know what temperature I run, but I just like being cozy. And so at home, sometimes if I, like this summer, I bought a new hoodie that I loved and I would turn the air conditioning down so it was colder so that I could wear my hoodie. And Sean walked in and was like, "Are you kidding me? This is very bad for the environment." And I was like, "I know, but still, I just like to feel cozy."
Oh no, I mean, I actually, you know, don't do it now, but when I was in grad school and undergrad, I would sleep with the window open because I love that feeling of having that really cool, fresh air and like being underneath, you know, the bed covers. So.
Yes, I do this at the cabin in the winter when it's like 10 degrees outside. We have the heated mattress pad cover that I'm obsessed with. I call it my cocoon. And I will turn that up and then have to crack the window a little bit to let the cold air in. And usually the fire's dying down and it's such a small, tight space that we end up like heating ourselves out of the cabin in like February in Maine. It is possible. Okay. The last one, what makes a cabin a cabin? And also I'm just so intrigued about the A-frame idea and whether A-frames are by default cabins or a separate category of their own.
So do you understand how much anxiety this question has caused me the last couple of weeks?
I do not.
And I was actually just listening to last week's podcast in the car last night when I was at softball practice, and little mountain frame, and she, you know, she sort of nailed it. You know, that's very much how I feel about it. I mean, I was thinking about it before I listened to that, but to me, the two words are setting and scale. And we have a debate between Melinda and I whether the A-frame is a cabin. I use that. I mean, partly for marketing, I use that term, but it does to me feel just a little too big to kind of, I mean, it's 1,400 square feet. So it's cabin, you know, I feel is a little bit of a stretch there. So no, I don't think every A-frame is a cabin.
But I would so put you in that category because I look at it and it just feels.
It's got the feel. I mean, but I think the scale is, you know, it's really borderline. I mean, that's how I I'm perfectly happy with people calling it a cabin, and I call it
Yeah.
a cabin. So yes, I think it's scale and setting. I mean, I know you've talked about, is a house on a beach a cabin? I think
Right.
if it's the right design and set in the right way and is the right scale, I think it is a cabin. And I just go back to, thinking about, I mean, it's sort of an escape, but then I think, maybe it was in last night's podcast I was listening to about, traditionally, the cabin it wasn't a vacation spot or a retreat. It was somewhere where you lived. And when I think, maybe that was last night, that it made me immediately think of the Dick Proenneke sort of documentary that they show on PBS when they're doing fundraisers, where he builds like a cabin out in the Alaskan wilderness and he lives there full time. I mean, that was a full-time cabin, but it's very much, it wasn't a retreat. That's where he lived.
Mm-hmm. But isn't that like what originally
I think, yes.
started our thoughts of cabins? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, I mean, I think setting, definitely. So like I said, I don't think it necessarily has to be in the woods or the mountains. I mean, I think you can have a cabin in the prairie. It just needs to be the right scale, and that sort of thing. So
yeah, which is so hard for me because my very first cabin, and I will call it a cabin, is over 2,000 square feet. And it has 3 bedrooms, and you walk in and the ceiling is probably not all that different from yours in the A-frame. But I've never once questioned if that one was a cabin because it's a true log cabin. It's built out of logs, despite it being huge. There's no drywall anywhere. It's wood absolutely everywhere. And so everyone who goes there, including myself, is like, we call it the cabin. But it's so large that after all these conversations, it seems almost universal that everyone thinks it needs to be smaller.
Right. And that's a good point. I mean, like, you see all those sort of out west, in Jackson, like the log homes, are those, but those, is it a log home or is it a log cabin? And where does it cross the boundary between being a log cabin to a log home?
And now I'm rethinking that one. And Sean wants to call it cozy lodge instead of cozy cabin because he's like, it has more of a lodge feel than it does a cabin feel. And that makes sense to me because lodges have a lot of similarity to cabins other than scale, other than that size.
Yeah. But it's a really hard thing to define and pin down for sure.
But it's a fun conversation to have.
Yeah, no. And, I'm pleased to hear that you definitely look at ours and consider that a cabin. So.
Well, and there's nothing wrong with, I mean, to be clear for anyone else listening, like whether it's a really cool house in the woods or a cabin, it doesn't really matter. I'm just intrigued by the semantics. But I look at yours and I'd be like, let's go to this cabin immediately would be my thought. Yeah, it's beautiful. Rob, it was so great to meet you.
You too.
After so many DMs.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I think I probably initiated most of those, so I apologize for that.
Don't apologize. It's great. Look where we are now. And your cabin is done and it's beautiful. I'm so happy for you.
Well, like I said before, I mean, you were definitely early on in our process a real inspiration for us. I mean, I've not yet got up the courage to put my face on stories.
I know.
But, you definitely doing that early on in our process was very helpful to us. So
I'm so glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, well, we'll be in touch for sure. Thank you for making the time.
All right. No, it's been a joy and a pleasure. Thanks.
Right. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. And if you like what you heard, feel free to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or share some of your favorite parts over on Apple Podcasts and a review. If you have any suggestions for guests or feedback, you can always find us on Instagram at Cozy Rock Cabin and the Chalet Frame, spelled CHALA. See you next week, and thanks for joining us.